Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News. It's brought to you by Anson Evaluate and produced by Digital Law. So just for those who don't know, Digital Law is a niche law firm based in Barnsley in the UK, and we specialise in things to do with data protection, cyber law, and all things to do with technology matters as well. So I'll just pass over to the Managing Director, Peter Wright, just to introduce himself before we get started.
Thank you very much, Laura, and great to be back with everyone after the holidays. And we've got some, I think, very pertinent stories to look at today. Everything from vaccine passports to Facebook and data. So I will pass over to Laura to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, the first story today is in regards to the Irish's approach to data protection and the Max Schrems calling it Kafkaesque. So the Austrian has described Ireland's approach to protecting EU citizens' data as Kafkaesque and a waste of Irish taxpayers' money. So Mr. Schrems has been invited to appear on April 27th before a Justice Committee to discuss his complaint against Facebook user data policies, which since 2018 has been in the hands of Ireland's Data Commissioner Helen Dixon. So Mr. Schrems has also told the committee they believe that the DPC have tied up his data transfer case with unnecessary legal knots by favouring litigation rather than making a ruling in the case. He said that the Irish regulator has been exposed to well-founded but entirely avoidable criticism by the courts. And he basically says that this poses economic and reputational risks to the Ireland data protection regulator. So he's basically just saying that they're not doing things correctly.
Yes, both barrels there from Max Schrems, the man, let's not forget, responsible for the Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 decision that involved litigation against Facebook over a subject access request, and have on both occasions his court cases have led to the collapse of data sharing agreements between the European Union and the United States. Therefore, I think when he makes remarks like this, we do have to sit up and listen. I mean, his remarks there are going to the heart of the fact that both the Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 decisions were reached in long-running, expensive, costly litigation, which meant that, you know, the DPC dragged the whole thing through the courts rather than potentially just have decisions of the regulator and do it in their own tribunal. Instead, it was something that went all the way through litigation, all the way to the European Court of Justice on both occasions. And it's also going to the fact that we've got this Irish DPC regulating everyone from Facebook to Apple to Amazon to all of the big US tech firms that are domiciled in Ireland. Why are they all in Ireland? One big surprise: corporation tax rates were set at being very, very low for a long period of time in Ireland, and therefore that's where they've chosen to have their European operations centred. So that's why you've got a comparatively small and comparatively underfunded regulator like the Irish Data Protection Commissioner trying to effectively regulate all of these massive tech corporations with arguably insufficient resources to do so. And then here Schrems is saying even then, given the resources they get from the Irish taxpayer, it still isn't being used well. So it is pretty damning, really, from Schrems to be saying this, and it's not good for, I think, the reputation of Europe when you've got a regime like GDPR, and GDPR is going to evolve and develop and be reformed in the coming years. When you're trying to portray that as being the flagship in terms of data protection standards around the world, and trying to argue that, look, we're setting the standard here and other countries and other trade blocs should follow us, when the regulation and enforcement of that law against the tech companies that are using that data to the greatest effect is through the DPC, and he's saying here, look, the regulation enforcement simply isn't effective. That is a bit of a problem then for the European Union and the European Commission in terms of its policy setting agenda. So when Max Schrems says this stuff, I think we should sit up and take notice. It's not great that he's saying this, and it goes to the heart of the problem, I think, with regards to effective ongoing regulation of data by the EU.
Yeah, absolutely. And sticking with that, I've got another story that relates to the Irish data protection regulator as well. So this is in relation to Facebook and their investigation following a massive data breach. So I know we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, it might have been the last episode we did, about the Facebook data breach, where they've supposedly breached around 500 million users' data from 106 different countries. So people's names, email addresses, phone numbers, and etc. So it's kind of two stories here. There's the data breach that's been going on, and then also the Irish regulator have suspecting that Facebook is guilty of breaching data protection laws. So they're going to launch a formal investigation into Facebook, the data breaches that have been happening, and the Facebook have basically come back to that and said that they are willing to fully cooperate with this, and look forward to explaining the factors that led to the breach and the other protections in place to shield user data.
Yes, it's an interesting story, this, when we take this in parallel with Max Schrems' comments that we've just discussed, because in effect it's saying here, look, there was an incident dating back to 2019 that is now facing investigation by the Irish DPC, who are saying, we think that GDPR laws may have been broken, we're going to investigate, that will be ongoing. Yet the more recent breach of 500 million users' data that's been quite widely reported earlier this month, how long will it take until the DPC gets around to investigating that? How long will effective regulation take? And then what mechanisms could Facebook use to draw out any potential enforcement? You know, if this stuff happened and then a few months later you'd got an investigation, fine, and enforcement, I think people would sit up and take notice a lot more. I'm not going to point to the UK Information Commissioner as a paradigm, you know, as a sort of paragon of virtue here, because, you know, they have, to a certain extent, had problems with enforcement as well. If you think about the BA and Marriott breach, they were originally investigated. It took a number of months until they then announced fines, and then the best part of 12 months until those announcements were converted into actual enforcement. But I think we need to cut them a bit of slack, because the coronavirus pandemic did get in the way, and of course airlines and hotels heavily impacted by the pandemic. So I think that's one of the reasons why those fines were reduced from, you know, the hundreds of millions down to 20 odd million. But that's still, you know, comparatively speedy enforcement compared to what we're looking at here. And I think it's going to be, I think, quite important when it comes to investigating Facebook, both over this 2019 breach and the one this year, that the DPC is able to transparently demonstrate its attempts to regulate and enforce Facebook as an example to the other tech companies. And I think it's going to be important that for any other breaches that I identified, or areas where they think they've broken GDPR, that likewise that is dealt with in a speedy and transparent manner. Because otherwise, I think it is, as I said under the previous story, I don't think it's a great indictment for the approach to effective enforcement and regulation of GDPR within the European Union.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about Marriott and BA, like you said, the fines were issued last year, or the beginning of this year, but that breach actually took place in 2019. So the turnaround in terms of the ICO compared to the Irish data protection regulator, there's clear ways in which the Irish data protection regulator could speed up the process and improve. So it's just whether that happens as well.
Exactly. I think it's a matter, I think, of giving people confidence in what the regulator is doing, and that comes down to both the people of Ireland, the people of the European Union, and the tech companies themselves. I mean, I keep going back to the fact that when we had those Senate hearings, when Mark Zuckerberg and other tech CEOs appeared, probably coming up for about 18 months ago now, you know, they said if you do not like what we are doing, regulate us. Tell us what you do and don't want us to do, and we will follow it. Because I think it's a very confusing approach to data protection regulation in the States, where it's all done on a state-by-state basis. So he's saying, look, give us effective regulation and we will follow. I mean, Facebook has spent an awful lot of money lobbying in Europe to get the GDPR that they wanted. And therefore it is quite worrying and a bit of a concern when it looks like, even after all that lobbying and having watered GDPR down to the extent that they did, that there are still concerns that it is being breached, and breached quite openly by the looks of it. So it really is, I think, really incredibly important that the tech firms are able to see strong, effective enforcement and regulation as well, so that they know where they stand.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving back to the story that we missed then, so this is in regards to a solicitor that paid away £290,000 of sale proceeds after falling for email fraud. So this is a veteran solicitor who was tricked by an email fraud to pay out almost £300,000 in proceeds from a conveyancing transaction to a third party, and he's now been fined £10,000. So he was found guilty of multiple account rule breaches, and he's down largely to unfit system that relied on handwritten methods. So in this particular transaction, he was acting for a local company in 2018. The solicitor's disciplinary tribunal, heard that at some point there was email traffic between them that was compromised, which meant that the solicitor basically received an email detailing that the account for the sale proceeds to be transferred into has changed. He did seek to set up a telephone call with the client, who he thought was a client, to confirm these details, but they instead emailed him and showed them that these new details was correct. So he went ahead and made the transaction. It wasn't until then his bank informed him that the bank account he transferred the money to was suspicious, until he realised this. He did then report it to his insurers, but didn't report this to the police or the SRA. So they carried out their own investigation, which then led to him being fined £10,000.
Thanks, Laura. I mean, very interesting, this story. I think we have to bear in mind that we are reading about this in 2021, but it is talking about events in 2018, first of all. But that doesn't mean that they are still in any way excusable. I mean, thinking about it, it was in, I think, 2018, Laura, you joined the firm. And one of the first jobs that you did was to put together some training for one of our clients on spotting phishing email threats. And you went in and did a really good piece of training, presentations back when we could do that, going in to see clients. Now it's all over video, of course, but you did a lovely job demonstrating some of the ways this happens, and talking about the fact that email can be intercepted and suddenly you're no longer communicating with the party that you thought you were, and how to spot this and how to deal with it. And of course, one of the key things is to then sort of follow. And I mean, in a highly regulated sector like law, there's everything from the anti-money laundering regulations and various other things in place where you need to be mindful of those when you are then handling money, and in this instance, handling a client's money, sale proceeds from a property. And the fact that some of the basic stuff hasn't been followed here is a concern, and it's that bit that you referred to about he tried to make the phone call, said, oh, I need to speak to you about this, and of course the hacker that he's speaking to by that point says, oh, no need for you to call us, happy for you to go ahead. That isn't how the solicitor should have interacted. It should have been open up the file, get the client's phone number that you know and trust, and call that and say, can I just confirm for the avoidance of doubt that these instructions are correct? And if he'd done that, that would have turned around and said, what instructions?
Yeah, it was the fact that he went ahead and he knew he had to confirm that, and kind of fell for the trick in terms of what the typical like hacker would do, and just basically put it off and confirm it via email, because they obviously don't want to speak to you in person. And like you said, I think these threats are still ongoing now, and especially phishing attacks might be less common in terms of carried out in more a sophisticated way, and the way in which they've changed, the way in which they've carried out has changed over the times. But back in 2018, when that did happen, it was very common for these things to happen, and a lot of people were aware of it. So I think if people weren't then, there's a lot of people probably who are not aware of it now and would still fall for stuff like that. So I think it's just a reminder to, if you are vulnerable to phishing attacks, making sure that they are reported if you do fall for one, but also get training for your staff to make sure they know what to look out for as well, because it's simple things you can do to
Indeed,
prevent it.
I mean, it's quite a glaring error there, where clearly after this happened, the solicitor simply didn't know what he needed to do, who he needed to report it to, which regulators to speak to, and that's what's landed him in particularly hot water in this instance. You know, it should be one of the first things. I'm a victim of cyber fraud. Go to the police, get that crime reference number. I mean, he reported it to the insurers. I am very surprised that as part of that, the insurers didn't turn around and say, well, have you got the crime reference number? Because very often that's sort of the key to the door. Once you've got that number, it is an offence, it's being investigated. And then that has an impact on how the insurers deal with it. But this is just that you can't rely on your insurers to guide you through all this stuff. You need to know it, you know. You need to have your action plan in place so that if this happens, you aren't then left scrabbling around thinking, oh God, what have I got to do now? Who have I got to call? How do I do it? How do I get in touch with the information commissioner? How do I call the police? Do I call 999? No, you don't. You know, it's a matter of thinking about this stuff in advance, because there's too much to suddenly learn how to do it after the events actually happen. So it really is a matter of thinking about what's, you know, what if the worst happens, and sort of having a plan ready to go if it does, because unfortunately it's a matter of now when you are subject to a cyber attack rather than if. And inevitably with law firms, it's very often transactions like this that end up being compromised. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that I think for a lot of firms that have been operating in a more traditional way, and this solicitor, it's quite clear that they were still sort of operating using pen and paper for a large part of the transaction. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that over the course of the last 12 months, many firms have had to switch to online working. Many firms have had to switch to then using online systems that they might not be wholly familiar or comfortable with. And therefore, now that we're sort of opening our offices back up and getting back into the workplace for many firms, think quite carefully about, right, let's have a stock check of all the systems we're now using. Can we be sure we're using them safely and securely? What little things can we do to make sure that we are double checking and making sure that our whole system is safe and secure, particularly when you're handling client money? So, you know, if you're handling conveyancing transactions, if you're dealing with private client matters, you know, proceeds of people's estates, this is now, I think, after the difficulties of the last 12 months, where we need to sort of take stock, work out where we are, carry out a risk assessment, and then if you've got areas of risk and concern, 2021 is now the year to minimise those areas of risks where you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next story then. So this is in regards to COVID vaccine passports, which could create a two-tier society. So equality watchdogs are warning that certificates could actually break the law and lead to discrimination. So this whole thing is about, obviously, when you've had your COVID vaccine, the government are thinking about handing out these vaccine passports, which basically say that I've been vaccinated and I'm safe to go to these big events and things like that. But even Boris Johnson's own MPs are now criticising this and saying that it is intrusive, costly and really unnecessary. I know you said, Peter, just before this, even some of the events that they're going to start rolling out, saying that they're wanting these COVID vaccines, but also you're going to have a test beforehand. So it kind of gets rid of the whole element of the necessariness of the COVID vaccine if you're going to still have that test before you go to this football match or this concert. But a lot of the criticisms are coming from equality and human rights, and saying that it is a proportionate way of easing the restrictions in the UK, but of also saying that it is could also lead to excluding people from everyday life, which is obviously not the aim of this. And they've even warned that a no jab, no job policy could be illegal before the entire population have been offered the jab. So I know there's plans in the care, especially so in the NHS and things like that, to say that if you don't have your vaccine, you can't work and things like that, unless there's a reason as to why you can't have your vaccine. So there's probably going to be legal challenges around that as well.
Yes, this is a massive story, of course, and I think we could probably have spent the entirety of this week's episode discussing vaccine passports. But let's just break it down into a few easy points for now. I think the first thing is the fact that it's going to be the design and construction of an app that might be quite complex. Let's not forget it took months and months for us to get that NHS contact tracing app up and running, the one that we're now having to scan the QR code whenever you go into a hospitality venue or into retail quite often as well. You have to scan this thing. It took months for that to get up and running, and an awful lot of money was spent on it and wasted. Before then, we're now talking about something that is far more specific. You know, this would have to sync with your NHS health records. It would have to sync with your proof of receiving your vaccine, potentially both injections, 1 and 2, and what vaccine have you had and when and all this stuff. And also, it now seems this thing would carry evidence of a recent COVID test.
Yeah.
Because, as you quite rightly say, Oliver, they're now saying that, I think it's the FA Cup final, they're now saying will be a test event for getting thousands of people back into football stadiums, albeit I think they're only looking at getting sort of 10,000 into Wembley Stadium, which holds over 100,000. So you're still going to have people, by the looks of it, quite widely socially distanced still. And I think one of the reasons why they're now saying, well, we're going to do the test as well, is that then that gets round the discrimination point that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission is highlighting, because they're saying, look, there are some people that cannot get vaccinated. At the moment, you know, it's only all those who are above 50 who've been vaccinated. So you've still got a large part of the population who are not vaccinated. You've got children who are at the moment unlikely to be vaccinated, and there's a question mark, I think, on what happens to you know, to those below 18 and 16 to 18 and those in secondary school. You've got people who are unable to have it for religious grounds and health grounds, and various reasons why you cannot get a vaccine. So we're basically saying to them, you do not have access to all of these wonderful things. It's stay in the house for you when everyone else can carry on living. Has quite draconian overtones to it. So the way of getting around that is to say, well, whether you have the vaccine or not, you've still got to go and have the cotton swab up the nose, which is, as I understand it, a rather unpleasant experience, before then you get your sort of 48-hour valid COVID test to say, no, I've not got COVID, now you can let me into the football ground or the music festival, etc. Now, at the moment, when it comes to these COVID certificates, and if you listen to the Prime Minister's press conference, he's falling over himself to say the word COVID certificate rather than vaccine passport, for the very reasons that I've just said with regards to discrimination. So that's why they're being so careful with this. I think the worrying thing is the direction of travel, because a few months back, the government and the Prime Minister himself were saying, I hate the idea of doing this, we wouldn't do it. And then, no, we won't do it, suddenly becomes, actually, yes, we are going to have to do it. Almost like they're sort of being dragged kicking and screaming in this direction by the who knows, the scientists at the civil service. We don't know, but the point is the goalposts keep being set and then they move over time, sometimes over quite a short period of time at that. And while I think an awful lot of people are sort of at the breaking point of saying, you know what, I don't care If it means I've got to have this passport on my phone so I can go and have a pint, so I can go along to the shops, so I can resume my life, I will do it. And I think an awful lot of the population isn't really going to listen to the issue, the concerns around privacy. They're just going to go, I just want my life back. Can we please get on with it? But I think it is worth listening to the privacy campaigners, because they're saying, look, once we give this power away, how long will we have to have this? Don't forget, you know, Britain is the country that persisted with rationing after World War II for 7 years. You know, there were people in the 1950s still having their food rationed, even though there was plenty of food around, because once the government is given a certain amount of power, it gets loath to give it up. And do we want to walk around with these apps on our phones for years and years and years? Do you want to be stopped from walking in somewhere just because you haven't got your phone on you, or because the app suddenly chooses that moment to stop working on you, or your battery suddenly goes down? So it's all well and good to think, let's just get on with it, but start thinking of the practical implications. And I think a final point is the history of government and big data, certainly in this country, is not a good one. No. It takes time to build the apps. They very often end up being easily breached. There can be issues around privacy and security. They might not necessarily be properly accurate. So imagine your frustration if you've been vaccinated or you've had your COVID test, and then you go and swipe the app and it says, no, you can't get in. Well, I'm afraid government IT, that's the sort of thing that could very easily potentially happen. So I think we do need to think quite carefully about this in terms of, do we want to give the state that power? Do we want our freedom to be at the mercy of dodgy government IT? And I say that dodgy just from the point of view it rarely works properly. And, you know, is this the world that we wish to find ourselves in for the next 5 years? Does it have to be this way? Particularly when it looks like, as I say, we're going down the route of COVID testing. I mean, whoever's still doing the COVID test must be rubbing their hands with glee, because they were probably thinking, well, now we're having the vaccines, the volume of tests will fall. But in fact, no, they're saying everyone will have to get tested if you want to go along to the Glastonbury Festival, or if you want to go and see Chelsea v Liverpool. So, you know, it's embedding this stuff into our lives and into our cultures for the foreseeable future. You know, not the short term. This is medium term stuff we're looking at here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the true question here is like whether this is going to be applied, because there is questions as to whether, like, are we going to use these COVID vaccine passports or the COVID certificates on a daily basis? Is it going to be having to go to the pub and you're using it, going shopping and using it, or is it just going to be for these larger events? If it's for the larger events, it seems a lot more reasonable to do it, but I think it's getting the right balance there in terms of how they're going to be used, what they're going to be used for, and what data is going to be collected and things like that as well.
Exactly. I think the big thing is that, you know, they originally were being called vaccine passports, and I think people quite accepted the idea of, if you have to show this in order to go on holiday to Spain or Greece, I think people would be perfectly fine with that. And indeed, at the moment, you know, over the course of the last year, if you want to travel, you've had to turn up with a valid COVID test taken within sort of the last 24 hours to show that you are safe to fly. So I think people are quite willing to have the idea of vaccine status for when you travel. It's the idea of you having to keep this thing on you for use every day, as you quite rightly say, and that's a real shift compared to what we've been used to. Let's not forget that 20 years ago, the government tried to bring in ID cards. And at the time, it was ruled as something, it was found to be something that would have been so expensive and so unwieldy to use that the cost suddenly, even though this was just an estimation, went up to the sort of tens of billions, and it was suddenly found to be unworkable. And even then, the justification was on the back of terror attacks, that this is a mechanism that will keep us safe. So you can see that whole thing, oh, well, this is what's necessary to keep us safe. But I think the pressures that came to bear 20 years ago with the government's ID card scheme then will start to come in here. And suddenly you're talking about an app that's going to be sort of all-encompassing and really is going to be ID cards via the back door. And this has always been a country where, apart from in time of war, you don't need to walk out the front door with your sort of ID card or your papers. You know, it's not been a case of where you get to the checkpoint and have to prove who you are. That's not what the UK has ever been about, but it could be what we're about within the next few months if we aren't careful.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the last story today then. So this is just in regards to some security updates that have been released by Microsoft Exchange servers. So this is a story from the NCSC, and they are encouraging organisations to install critical updates following a number of vulnerabilities that have been addressed in Microsoft Exchange. So the affected versions are the Exchange servers of 2013, 2016 and 2019. And organisations running on out of support versions of Microsoft Exchange are also encouraged to update to a supported version without delay. So I know we mentioned a similar story to this a couple of months ago, but this is basically just an advance on this and another reminder to make sure everything is kept up to date.
Indeed, so this is the National Cybersecurity Centre trying to alert everyone to these risks and saying make sure that you update your systems. I think it is slightly worrying if people are still out there using unsupported versions of Microsoft. That is Microsoft Exchange. That is the route where we found that, for example, the NHS was vulnerable to the WannaCry cyber attack, malware attack a couple of years ago because it was using unsupported versions of Microsoft products. And it is a similar vulnerability here if either you're using something that is unsupported and not receiving the updates, or you're receiving the updates and haven't put them in place. So really important to do this. These vulnerabilities are not something that can be easily ignored, and if the National Cybersecurity Centre is turning around and saying you've got to do it, I think it is really a good idea to turn around and do it. So if it means scheduling that update for over a weekend or overnight at a time when hopefully your system is a little bit quieter, really important to get on and do it, because you don't then want to find that that vulnerability has unfortunately been exploited by the unscrupulous.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's everything we have time for today. So just a little reminder for our listeners, this is the GDPR compliance manual for legal practices, which is now down to £99 from £195, sorry. So this is available in a hard copy and digital copies as well. So I'll just pass over to Vita just to give you a little bit more information as to what it includes.
Yes, so this is our GDPR compliance manual for law firms, but it's also been, I think, a benefit for some of our accounting and financial services clients, many of whom have appreciated a lot of the tools that are in there. It's got everything from templates to forms to checklists to help you embed GDPR compliance across the way your firm operates. What it tries to do is to say, look, don't reinvent the wheel here. So if you've already got risk and compliance meetings in your firm, it's just adding in little bits to say, well, here is the GDPR element to that, so that you can hopefully save time with regards to your GDPR compliance, and you can use existing mechanisms to then demonstrate ongoing compliance on an ongoing basis to the regulators, both the ICO and the SRA. And I say there's some really good practice in there anyway, so it applies really to any organisation that wants to take its compliance seriously and be able to, if the worst does happen, I say it's not a matter of if, but when you'll be hacked, you want to be able to turn around to the regulator and say we've done everything that we could have been expected to, given our size and given our resources. And there's little tips in here that will help any organisation to be able to tick the box there.
Great. And just a reminder as well, and a thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping us produce this webinar. Just for those who don't know, Anson Evaluate is a consultancy company, and they provide training and webinars and consulting services to clients across the UK and across the world basically as well. So I have listed their contact information on the screen, which is admin@ansonevaluate.com, and they also have a website which is www.ansonevaluate.com as well, and they offer a wide range of services. So they help you with training, producing webinars and other services as well. So if you're interested in any of those, please do get in touch.
Yes, I think it's always important to emphasise the fact that if you are at the moment unable to organise training in person, or struggling to get communications out to clients and contacts, then if you need help with that, if you need a webinar producing like this, or if you'd like a podcast or an audio package that you can use, or a training package that you need for your staff, then contact Anson Evaluate. They have expertise in this area and can help you to break through that digital barrier and use the technology, even if technology is not your forte and you simply are a bit overwhelmed and don't know where to start. Then you can rely on our friends at Anson Evaluate.
Great, thank you. So yeah, that's everything we've got time for today. So just a reminder that these webinar and podcasts are available on a weekly basis through our website, our YouTube channel, and also on any podcast channels as well, so Apple and Spotify and other podcast channels. So thank you once again for listening, and we hope to see you next week.